In a low valley, nestled deep within the rolling hills of the northern realm, the world seemed wrapped in silence. Not the silence of peace, nor the silence of death, but the kind that lingers in the quiet corners of places long forgotten, where even the wind sighs as it passes, too tired to stir the leaves. There, in the remote fief of Elder Glen, life moved not with haste, but with the slow rhythm of toil and the hush of resignation. It was on such a land, beneath a sky the colour of smoke and ash, that a child named Toma was born. His cry came faint, more of a whimper than a wail, and the midwife did not speak a word. She only nodded, wiped the child clean with a frayed scrap of linen, and handed him into the trembling arms of his mother. Beside them, a small fire hissed weakly in the hearth, giving off more smoke than warmth, as if reluctant to offer even that. Toma did not know it then. How could he? But from the moment he drew his first breath, he belonged to the land. Not, in the poetic sense, as a creature of nature or heir to the earth, but quite literally. He was bound to it, in body and in right, by the laws that governed this feudal world. For Toma, like his father before him, and his father's father before, that was a serf. A serf was not a slave, but neither was he free. It was a strange and silent bondage, written not in chains, but in duties, oaths, and unspoken truths. A serf could not leave his lord's land without permission. He could not sell his labour freely, nor could he marry or pass inheritance without a nod from the manor. His children would carry the same burden he bore, just as he bore the burden of his forebears. It was inheritance not of wealth, but of servitude. Toma's father, Ranulf, worked the fields of Lord Arcelin, a noble neither cruel nor kind, just distant, like a winter star that gave off little light and no warmth. Ranulf's back was bent not by age, but by furrows ploughed too deep and years stacked too high. His hands were calloused, cracked and creased like bark, and his face wore a grim patience that only serfs seemed to master. Every morning, before the cock crowed, Ranulf would rise. He moved without sound, dressing in the same patched tunic, shouldering the same wooden ploughshare, and stepping out into a world that did not care whether he woke or not. His breath steamed in the air, and the soil, cold, damp, unyielding, seemed to mock him with its silence. Yet he went, every day, without protest. This was the way. It had always been the way. Inside their cottage of wattle and daub, Toma's mother, Ellen, sang soft songs under her breath as she ground oats into meal. The songs had no names, no beginning or end, just melodies passed down from mothers to daughters and remembered in the bone. Her hands were red from scrubbing, her voice often hoarse, but still she sang, for there was little else to keep the dark at bay. Toma, as a child, never questioned it. The narrow world of Elder Glen was all he knew. He learned to walk between furrows, to listen for the sound of hoofbeats that meant the reeve was near, and to keep his gaze low when men of this manor passed. He learned early that the best way to survive was to go unnoticed. It wasn't until he was 7 that he first heard the word freeman. It came from a travelling peddler who'd stopped by the edge of the village, selling iron nails and combs made of bone. The man wore boots of real leather, and his eyes glinted like morning frost. When asked where he came from, he said simply, "I go where I please." Toma didn't speak for hours after the man left. That night, he asked his father, "Why don't we go where we please?" Ranulf sat still for a long time before answering. He stared into the fire as though it might tell him something different this time. "Because we don't belong to ourselves," he said, his voice rough. "We belong to the land." It was then that Toma first understood. Not fully, not in the way an adult understands, but in the quiet, sharp way children feel truth. He felt the weight of that sentence settle in his chest like a stone. And so, he grew. He learned how to yoke oxen, though their ribs showed like shadows under their skin. He learned how to thatch roofs and mend broken tools with twine and prayer. He learned to plant seed in soil too thin and reap crops too small. And always, always, he paid his dues. A third of the barley went to Lord Arsalan. A tenth of the rest went to the church. What remained was divided among neighbours and kin, sometimes traded for salt or wool, but never enough. Hunger was not an emergency in Elderglen. It was a season. Each winter came with its own cruelties. Frost crept beneath the doors, rats found their way into the larder, and the cough of old folk never seemed to stop. Toma's younger brother died in his second winter, his breath slowing until it stopped, unnoticed in the night. There was no doctor, no priest that week, just silence. But there were good moments too. A stolen plum in late summer. A day when the work ended early and the sky turned pink. The warmth of another's hand in the cold. They did not laugh often, but when they did, it came as a blessing. Still in the back of Toma's mind, the peddler's words lingered like a stubborn weed. I go where I please. It was a seed of thought, planted in soil as bitter as any field. And though the manor, walls loomed tall, and the laws remained unchanged, the idea had taken root. A life bound to the soil may seem quiet from afar, but within, it is a story of inherited burdens, of silent yearning, and of dreams that dare not speak aloud. And so we leave young Toma, gazing at the stars through the smoke hole of his roof, wondering what lies beyond the hills, and whether the sky looks different in places where men go where they please. In Elderglen, they called it the lean month, though in truth, it was never just a month. It came in whispers. First, the stores ran low, then the stew became thinner, then the children stopped running, their limbs too tired to pretend. And then, quietly, the hunger came to stay, like a shadow slipping beneath the door. It was not a visitor. It was a neighbour. Toma first remembered true hunger when he was 9. It had been a dry summer, the kind that cracked the earth like pottery and stole, the softness from the wind. The barley grew stunted and yellow, the cabbages bolted early, and the orchard, which usually gifted them a few apples in October, bore nothing but curled leaves. The Lord's reeve still came, of course. The tithe had to be paid, no matter the yield. Serfs did not offer excuses. They offered their grain, their hens, and sometimes their silence. That year, the silence was loud. The manor took its third of the harvest. The church took its 10th. And what remained could barely fill the family's wooden chest, let alone their stomachs. Ranulph did not complain. Complaining was for those who thought someone might listen. Instead, he began to portion everything. Each meal became a careful measurement. The morning porridge, once thick with oats and the occasional root, became a whisper of warmth. By dusk, their bellies groaned like hollow drums. We must stretch it, he would say, just until the frost lifts. But the frost did not lift, not soon, and the hunger did not wait. It wasn't the sharp, gnawing hunger of a day skipped, nor the panic of sudden need. It was slower than that, deeper, a dull ache that settled in the bones, that made the world feel farther away. It took the sparkle from the eyes and the blush from the cheeks. It made the skin thin and the silence heavier. Toma watched his little sister, Mira, stop speaking as often. She would sit with her doll, no more than a bundle of rags, and stare at nothing for hours. Her laugh, once quick to come, vanished like the summer bees. His mother, Ellen, grew quieter too. She began giving portions of her meal to the children. At first it was subtle. A piece of turnip left uneaten. A bit of crust passed with a smile. But soon it became obvious. Her cheeks sank, her hands trembled, and her breath came shorter with each day. Toma asked her once, "Aren't you hungry, Mama?" She smiled with her eyes closed. "Not today, my heart. I'm full from watching you grow." But Toma saw through it. Even as a child, he knew what sacrifice looked like. Hunger had many faces, but the cruelest was the one that smiled. As the cold deepened, Ranulph took to the woods more often. He set snares for rabbits, though most were too clever or too few. He gathered roots and bark and once returned with a squirrel, thin as a twig and half frozen. That night, the stew tasted rich, but no one mentioned the bones in their bowls. Not everyone in the village fared the same. Old Thomas, the thatcher, died in his sleep, come December. His daughter swore he hadn't eaten in 3 days. A child, named Wheeler, was found near the river, her hands blue, a crust of ice on her lips. No one had seen her since the week before. The priest gave a sermon on God's mercy. He said suffering brought the soul closer to heaven. But Toma wondered if heaven was just another place with empty plates. In those long nights, time slowed. The dark pressed close, not just outside the cottage, but inside their thoughts. There was little to do but sit near the embers and listen to the wind, to each other's breathing, to the rumble of a stomach that had long since stopped complaining and simply waited. Hunger, Toma learned, made everything smaller. The days, the dreams, the smiles, even the sky above seemed to shrink, as if ashamed to look down. And yet, they survived. Spring came late, dragging its feet like an old man. The first shoots of green were met with cautious joy. The frost lifted, the soil softened, and the planting began again. But something had changed. The hunger did not leave with the snow. It stayed in their memories, in the way Ellen watched over the grain bin, in the way Mia flinched at the sound of an empty bowl placed down too hard. It lingered in the bones and in the breath. Because once hunger had lived with you, it never quite moved out. That summer, Toma helped with the sewing. His hands, though young, had grown calloused. He no longer asked for seconds at meals. He had learned to pretend he was full, even when his stomach betrayed him. Ranulph seemed older, though no more years had passed than usual. His eyes were sunken, and his cough had a rattle to it. Still, he worked, because work was survival, and survival was all a serf could aim for. Toma once overheard 2 older men speaking in hushed tones beside the well. One said, "Better a famine than the war years." The other only shook his head and spat. "Hunger's a slow death. War's at least quick." Toma didn't understand then what war meant, but he remembered the words and the weight they carried, as if there were choices, as if one misery could be measured against another. But for serfs like Toma's family, there were no choices, only seasons. Some were green, some were grey, and some were bone white and cruel. That was the rhythm of life in Elderglen. And as the stars returned to their summer paths and the fireflies blinked among the thatch, Toma lay awake, his fingers tracing the wooden slats of the roof above. He was older now, though not by years. Hunger had aged him in ways no feast could undo, and in that silence he whispered to the darkness, not a prayer, not a wish, but a question. "Will next winter be kinder?" No one answered. Not the wind, not the stars, not even the land, which simply waited, as it always had, for someone to kneel and begin again. The manor stood at the hill's crest, as it always had, stone-faced and silent, its towers barely tall enough to scrape the sky, yet high enough to make those below feel small. It was not a castle of grandeur, but a symbol of dominion, its presence alone enough to command bowed heads and lowered voices. To young Toma, the manor had always been more myth than place. He'd never stepped inside. No serf had, not unless summoned or punished. It was a place of reckoning, not refuge, and though the stone walls were chipped with age and softened by moss, they still radiated something colder than winter, authority. The man who lived there, Lord Arcelin, was rarely seen. He did not walk the fields, nor tend his animals, nor pull weeds from his own gardens. Such tasks belonged to others, to them, the serfs. His tenants in name, his labourers in practice, and his property in all but parchment. But despite his absence, Lord Arcelin's presence wrapped itself around every aspect of their lives like ivy on a crumbling wall. His name was spoken softly, not in reverence, but in caution. A scythe left leaning too long against a fence might be noted. A piglet that vanished before tally might be reported. And always, there were eyes. Not the Lord's own, but those of his reeve, his steward, and the old bailiff who kept careful track of dues. Toma remembered the first time he saw Arsalan, not in the flesh, but from afar. It was the harvest procession, when the Lord would ride down to inspect the fruits of labour he had not laboured for. He came flanked by 2 men-at-arms, dressed not in battle plate, but in leathers still rich with dye. His horse was tall, its hooves like thunder on the packed dirt. The villagers gathered, hushed and still, their heads bowed so low that their necks ached for days. Lord Arsalan said little. He nodded once, thin-lipped, then disappeared into the hall where wine and venison awaited him. Meats not seen on serf tables, even at Christmas-tide. Was he kind? Toma had asked his father afterward. Ranulf wiped sweat from his brow and answered, without turning, "He was here. That is enough." Kindness was a luxury serfs did not expect. The manor collected rent not just in grain, but in labour. Each week, serfs owed days to the domain, working the lord's personal fields, mending, his fences tending his flocks. And though their own plots suffered from weeds and wear, these obligations could not be skipped. To do so was to invite the steward's wrath, a man named Berun, whose face was a line of hard angles and whose voice could dry water. Berun once caught a boy gathering firewood from the manor's woods, an area forbidden without writ. The boy, no older than 10, had gathered wind-fallen sticks, not stolen, not chopped, just picked from the forest floor. The punishment was swift. The boy's family lost their right to a share of the autumn hay. That winter, their roof collapsed, and his younger sister died of fever. No one questioned the fairness. Fairness did not apply beneath the Lord's shadow. Even the priest, Father Ulrich, seemed to bow deeper when Arsalan's steward attended Mass. He would raise prayers for the Lord's health, though no one quite believed illness could ever touch those who lived behind stone. Toma grew wary of the manor, even from afar. He would glance toward it when in the fields, noting how it watched, over the land like a hawk from a high branch. Its windows, dark and small, seemed like eyes that never blinked. There were rumours, of course, that Lord Arsalan had once fought in France, that he'd killed a man in a duel, that he kept a silver goblet shaped like a skull. But no one really knew. The Lord was like the moon, distant, pale and powerful, dictating tides while never stepping into the ocean. Once, during a summer storm, lightning struck a tree near the manor wall. The next morning, Berun declared that 2 oxen must be given from the village to repair damages. Toma never understood how animals would mend a tree, but no one argued. Arguing was not the serf's privilege. Fear, in Elderglen, was not loud. It was quiet and constant. It lived in the way people paused before speaking, how they turned when certain men approached, how they stored grain secretly in the walls for when the reeve came counting. And yet, paradoxically, this fear did not boil into rage. It cooled into habit. Toma learned to accept the Lord's dominion not as tyranny, but as weather. It was simply there, like rain, like hunger, like the frost that killed too soon. He came to understand that power, true power, did not need to shout. It only needed to be present, to let others fill the silence with obedience. The manor did not beat its serfs with whips. It beat them with expectations, that they would rise when called, that they would offer tribute, that they would kneel without needing to be told. Toma began to wonder sometimes what lay behind those stone walls, what Lord Arsalan feared, if anything, whether he remembered the names of those who broke their backs for him, or whether the village existed only as a column of numbers in a steward's ledger. One dusk, as he carried a bundle of kindling home, Toma paused on the ridge where the path forked. One trail led to the fields, the other to the manor gate. He stared at it, Not long, just enough to feel the weight of it pressing against his chest. Then he turned away. The path to power was not his to tread. That night, as he lay in the warmth of his family's shared blanket, the fire casting long shadows on the wall, Toma whispered a thought he did not understand. I wonder if he dreams too. But the wind did not answer. The Lord's shadow had no voice, only presence. And presence, Toma knew, was enough. The sun had not yet risen, but the world was already stirring. Before the first light crept over the hills of Elderglen, before the sky had even shed its deep blue hush, Toma awoke to the brittle creak of old wood shifting under the cold. His father, Ranulf, was already at the door, pulling his tunic over tired shoulders, the fabric stiff from a week's worth of sweat and weather. Toma sat up slowly. His limbs ached with the familiar heaviness of unfinished sleep, but he made no complaint. Complaining did not change the morning. It only wasted it. In the center of their single-room cottage, the fire had gone out. Only a few sullen embers glowed beneath a crust of ash. His mother knelt beside it, coaxing it gently back to life with dried twigs and her breath. The light it cast was soft and flickering, painting her face in gold and shadow. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a thin mash of oat flour and water, warm just enough to make it feel like food. There was no meat, no milk. The goat had stopped giving weeks ago. No one spoke as they ate. It was not silence from sadness, but from routine. Once the last spoon had been licked clean, the day began. Outside, the ground was wet with dew. A low mist clung to the fields like a memory that refused to fade. The manor bell had not yet rung, but they were expected to be in the Lord's fields by first light. This was one of the domain days when work was owed directly to Lord Arcelin. There was no rotation, no respite. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday, the first hours belonged not to survival, but to duty. Toma joined his father and a dozen other men and boys, trudging toward the fields beyond the ridge. Their tools were carried on shoulders, wooden hoes, sickles, and spades, worn smooth by countless hands. Their boots squelched in the mud, their breath visible in the cold air, their voices few. At the field, the reeve stood waiting. He was a thin man with sharp eyes, a ledger bound in leather under one arm. He nodded, but said nothing. They knew what to do. Ranulf and the older men began turning the soil where last season's barley had grown. Toma was sent to pull stones. From the new plots, his hands quickly chilled to numbness. The earth was stubborn, clinging to its secrets, resisting the spade. But they worked it anyway. It was what they had always done. Hours passed not with bells, but with aches. The sun climbed slowly, and with it came warmth, but not comfort. Toma's back began to sting by midday. He paused only when he could no longer see straight, then stood, wiped his brow with a sleeve, and bent again. At noon the work stopped, briefly. They sat beneath a tree near the edge of the field, pulling out their noon fare. A crust of bread, hard as a stone, a piece of onion, a sliver of cheese if they were lucky. No one feasted. The food was meant to sustain, not satisfy. Toma chewed slowly, letting the bread soften against his tongue. His father drank from a leather flask, offering a sip to his son. It was water, faintly flavoured with mint from the spring. They did not speak much. Speech required energy. When the bell rang again in the distance, a dull clang that echoed like a reminder, the men stood and returned to their tasks. The afternoon was spent clearing brush from the hedgerows and mending a low stone wall that separated the domain from the common pasture. By the time the sun dipped low and turned the clouds to copper and rose, their bodies ached as though weighed down by the very sky. The reeve dismissed them with a nod. The walk home was quiet. Toma limped slightly, a blister forming near the heel of his foot. Ranulf said nothing, but slowed his pace to match. Back in the village, the cottages smoked gently, their chimneys sighing, into the dusk. Inside, Ellen had boiled a handful of wild greens and split peas into a thin soup. It smelled sharp, but filled the belly. They ate together, seated on the packed earth floor. Mia, now old enough to carry a bucket, had fetched water from the stream. She beamed when praised, her cheeks red with pride. It was the brightest moment of the day. After supper, they sat in a small circle near the fire. Ellen hummed softly as she spun wool. Ranulph sharpened a sickle. Toma lay on his side, eyes half-lidded, watching the shadows flicker on the wall. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. There were no books, no music beyond the breath of the wind. The only stories were those remembered from mouths, passed down from tongues too tired to embellish. Before sleep, Father Ulrich passed by. He offered a short prayer through the door's opening, blessing the household in Latin. They bowed their heads out of habit. The words were not understood, but the rhythm was soothing. As the fire burned low and the night crept in like a soft blanket, Toma closed his eyes. It had been a day. Not good, not bad, just a day, and tomorrow would be the same. There was no celebration for labor well done, no reward, no end, only the turning of the seasons and the rhythm of a life not owned but endured. And in that endurance, there was a strange peace, not joy, not fulfillment, but the quiet peace of knowing one had done all they could, and that it would begin again. The day Toma first noticed Breda was one of those rare golden afternoons that seemed to arrive without warning, wrapped in warmth and the scent of clover. She was laughing, not at him, not for him, just laughing, loud and unashamed, while splashing water on her younger sister at the edge of the stream. Her hair had slipped from its braid, strands catching in the breeze like ribbons of wild honey. Toma had gone to fetch water, but he forgot his bucket entirely and stood, breath tangled in his throat. Breda was the miller's niece, sent from the next village after her father's death. She had shoulders strong from lifting sacks of grain, and eyes sharp as hawk feathers. In the weeks that followed, Toma found reasons, clumsy, transparent reasons, to pass the mill more often. He was 17. They met under quiet pretenses, fetching turnips, walking beside the sheepfold, trading, jokes when the steward was far off. Love in a serf's world was not forbidden, but like everything else, it came with a cost. To marry, one needed permission, not from family, not even, in truth, from the village priest, but from the Lord. Under the feudal order, a serf belonged to the land, and that land belonged to the Lord. Marriage was not merely a personal vow, it was a transaction, a shift of labor and potential children, future generations of hands to till the earth. If Breda and Toma wed, it would alter the manor's accounts, however slightly, and so it required Lord Arcelin's leave. That leave came in the form of a merchet, a payment to the Lord, made in coin, livestock, or kind. It was a fee for the right to marry. Some families paid in chickens, others in sacks of rye or hours of extra labor. It was not optional. Without it, the union was not recognized, and punishment could follow. Toma's family had nothing to offer. "We can ask the steward," Ellen said softly, her hands busy spinning wool even as her mind turned over worry. "Maybe Baroon will grant it, for work done ahead." But Ranulph was less hopeful. "The steward remembers debts longer than favours," he muttered. "And the Reeves' cousin has his eye on the girl, if the rumours hold." Toma said nothing, not aloud, but inside something tightened. He had known since childhood that his life was not his own, that his sweat, his harvest, even his breath served a system older than memory. But to discover that love, simple, unthreatening love, was also to be measured and taxed, it stirred something bitter. He and Breda spoke beneath the rowan tree, by the boundary wall, the one marked with the old stones that had once divided the land long before any living villager was born. "What if we just leave?" he asked, eyes full of fire that had no place to go. Breda looked at him sadly, as though he were a child naming the stars. "We can't," she said. "They'd call us fugitives." And then, after a pause, They'd punish our families. My uncle, your father. You know how it goes. She was right. Serfs who fled the manor were pursued. If caught, they could be fined, beaten, even branded. And worse, their families left behind might suffer in their place. Collective punishment was not rare. Lords valued order above justice. Toma sat with her, silent, as the sun dipped low. In the trees, birds began their evening songs. Soft, uncertain, like lullabies offered to a world too weary to sleep. A week later, his father made the request. Berun listened without expression, then tapped his ledger with a crooked finger. "The boy is strong," he said. "He can give a year's labor to the manor's sheepfold in exchange. If he fails to finish it, the girl comes back to her kin." It was not a gift. It was a bargain. Toma accepted. For the next 12 moons, he worked the sheepfold at the edge of the manor's land, tending not his own flocks, but those of Lord Arcelin. He rose before light, waded through muck and fleece, chased lambs and fended off wolves. Rain soaked him. The cold cracked his skin, and every day he counted hours like coins in a thin purse. Breda waited. She brought him meals when she could. They spoke only in passing, but their eyes carried more than words. At the end of the year, the steward nodded once and made a mark in his ledger. They were wed beneath the same rowan tree where they had once spoken of escape. The priest said the rites. The villagers sang a song that had no author, but was known by all. Toma wore a tunic with mended seams. Breda wore a wreath of dried wildflowers. It was a wedding without riches, but full of something richer. And yet, even in joy, the truth remained. Their union had not been their own. It had been granted, permitted, taxed. Love, like grain, had passed through the Lord's hands before reaching theirs. As time passed, the couple made a life together. They shared a cottage of their own, near the stream, where the fire burned, a little longer into the nights, and laughter sometimes visited. But they never forgot the price. Toma often wondered what might have happened had they defied the rule, if they had run into the woods and crossed into a distant shire. But dreams such as those, like apples stolen out of season, carried risk, and serfs had learned not to gamble with what little they had. Still, on certain quiet evenings, Breda would sit by the hearth, weaving, her hands dancing with the thread. She would glance toward Toma and smile with a kind of softness untouched by the manor's reach. It was a quiet rebellion, because though the Lord had granted their marriage, he had not granted their joy, and that perhaps was the one thing they could truly claim as their own. The church bell rang before the sun, as it always did on Sundays. Its sound was soft in the morning mist, dull and distant, like a memory echoing across fields still wet with dew. The villagers of Elderglen stirred from their beds not with haste, but with reverence. For Sunday was not a day of rest as one might imagine. It was a day of obligation. Toma rose quietly. Breda was already tending to the small hearth, coaxing the coals back to life with careful breaths. The scent of smoke curled through their cottage, mingling with the faint sweetness of rye. Mira, now nearly grown, laced her shoes with quick fingers. Even on sacred days, she moved with the energy of spring. They dressed simply. No finery, of course, but clean tunics, patched with care, and Breda's best shawl. Toma helped straighten it, and she smiled, just slightly, but enough. The church stood at the edge of the village, near the oldest yew tree. It was small, stone-built with a crooked bell tower and a door that creaked in all seasons. Its interior was dark and chill, even in summer, lit by only a few narrow windows and the thin shafts of light that pierced the dust. There was no grandeur here, no golden icons or vaulted ceilings, just a plain altar, a wooden crucifix, and the worn kneeling boards where generations had pressed their hopes into the earth. Father Ulrich greeted them as they entered. He was an old man now, his beard more salt than snow, his voice thin as parchment, but his eyes were still bright, and his hands steady when lifting the chalice. He spoke in Latin mostly, The villagers did not understand the words, not truly, but they bowed their heads at the right moments and whispered the responses as best they could. The rhythm of the Mass was comfort enough. It was not the meaning, but the motion that brought peace. For many, the church was the only place where time paused. It was in those quiet hours, kneeling beside Breda, that Toma often let his mind wander. He would watch the light shift through the dusty air and wonder if heaven truly lay beyond the clouds, as the priest said. He imagined fields that never flooded, bread that never vanished, children who never starved. But faith was not free. At the close of every Mass came the tithe. A tenth of their produce, grain, eggs, even a portion of wool, was offered to the church. It was not voluntary. It was the price of salvation, the cost of heaven's gate. To deny it was to risk one's soul, or so they were taught. Toma remembered the year they had no eggs to spare. Their only hen had been taken by a fox, and Breda wept to Father Ulrich, explaining their lack. He had listened kindly, but his answer was firm. God sees all offerings, he said, even what is withheld. They gave a sack of barley instead, one they could not afford to lose. That winter, they went without porridge for 3 weeks. Breda's skin lost its colour, and Toma's joints ached from the cold. Still they gave. All did. The church was not only a place of worship, but a pillar of life. It was where children were baptized, where the sick were anointed, where the dead were buried beneath hallowed soil. To fall out of favour with the priest was to fall out of favour with the community, and Father Ulrich, though gentle in manner, held power. He could refuse a wedding. He could deny a funeral. He could withhold the sacrament and, by extension, grace itself. But there was more than obligation. There was also hope. It was the hope that all suffering meant something, that the toil, the hunger, the quiet griefs of every day were not in vain, that the meek, as Scripture promised, would indeed inherit the earth. The priest's sermons often told of paradise, not in this life, but in the next, a world where no one owed rent, where children played without fear, where bread was always warm and wine flowed without end. Toma listened with a strange ache in his chest, not disbelief, but a longing so deep it felt like sorrow. He wanted to believe, truly, that there was more than this, that their prayers would rise above the manor roofs and the yew trees and find favour in a place untouched by mud and stone. Sometimes he prayed harder than he worked. Breda, too, had her devotions. She lit candles for the lost, whispering the names of siblings buried too soon. She sang the psalms with a voice soft and strong, like river reeds swaying under moonlight. Mir asked questions, many questions, and Father Ulrich answered with patience, drawing stories from parchment older than any living man. But not all found peace. There were murmurs now and then from those who doubted. Old Mais, the blacksmith's widow, had once whispered that the tithe did not reach the poor, that the church's wine was finer than any farmer had ever tasted. She spoke it only once, and only in the dark, but it lingered. Others wondered why. God listened only when coin was offered. Why blessings were conditional. Why the church, like the manor, always collected but rarely gave. Still, they returned each Sunday. For even if doubt lived in the corners of their hearts, fear held the centre. 2. Der Anschreiben was to die lost. To speak against the priest was to risk excommunication, a fate worse than hunger, for it meant eternal separation, not just from heaven, but from community. And so they gave, and they prayed, not because they were fools, but because they were weary, because something, anything, had to give shape to the suffering. And if that shape was the cross, then they would bear it. On one particular evening, as the sun fell behind the hills and the bell marked Vespers, Toma stood alone by the yew tree beside the church, its twisted branches stretched like old fingers toward the fading light. He thought of his father, long buried, of the baby Breda had lost 2 winters past, of the war rumours carried on the wind, of Mare, who dreamed of towns she'd never see, of the world beyond Elderglen, imagined but unreachable. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for wealth, not even for freedom, just for rest, for peace, for the grace to endure one more day, and in that breath, beneath the watching sky, and the weight of centuries, faith flickered, not bright, but steady. In the waning days of September, when the air turned sharp and the fields lay golden and ready for harvest, the villagers of Elderglen found themselves caught between 2 seasons, between bounty and burden, between joy and judgment. It was during this time that the tacksman came, not cloaked in shadow nor carrying weapons, but with parchment and quill, accompanied by a reeve whose boots knew every path in the village. He arrived not as a soldier of the king, but as the hand of the Lord, the one who would measure, record, and collect. They called it the Great Reckoning. Once every few years, and always after harvest, the bailiff of Lord Arshellin would descend upon the village with a solemn caravan of scribes and sacks of ink. They would take account of every beast, every bushel, every child born since the last tally. They recorded what the land gave and what the Lord was owed. Toma remembered the first time he saw the tally sheets. They looked harmless, almost elegant, rows of neat ink, names spelled with care. But beneath each line lay a weight heavier than stone. His name was there, as was Breda's, and Mira's. So too were the chickens they had raised, the patch of barley they'd planted, and the 2 goats that grazed near the stream. All of it, recorded, all of it taxable. It is the price of peace, the steward said, as though rehearsed. The coin that buys protection, the duty we owe to the soil and the shield. But peace was not free, and coin did not come easily to serfs. Toma had no silver. Few in Elderglen did. What they paid was in kind. Sacks of grain, lengths of wool, pots of honey, bundles of flax. Every household scraped what they could, and, still, the ledgers seemed to frown. This year, the harvest had been fair, not abundant, but kind enough to feed. Yet, as the bailiff walked from door to door, inspecting cellars and questioning children, an unease settled over the village like autumn mist. He asked questions no one dared answer too quickly. Did you sell wool in the market last Candlemas? How many eggs does your hen lay a week? Why does your shed have a new thatch if you claimed poor repair? Every answer was another thread in the net. Breda had mended their roof with scraps from her uncle's barn. But when the bailiff noticed it, he made a mark in his ledger. A roof so sound may weather an extra tithe, he muttered. Toma bit his tongue. To protest was dangerous. To lie was worse. The villagers called it the thin month, the time after taxes when bellies tightened again, not from drought, but from dues. The goods collected were carted off to the manor granary, some to be stored, others sold. It was said Lord Arshellin rarely tasted the grain himself, but his household would feast, and the steward's pantry would not go wanting. That year, the tacksman's visit coincided with the feast of St. Cuthbert, a holiday meant for joy. Children wore garlands of thistle and elderflower. The church bells rang, and Father Ulrich led a procession around the yew tree, singing litanies in Latin and lifting his hands toward the sky. But joy and debt are uneasy bedfellows. The feast was modest, a stew thickened with turnips, flatbread baked over coals. One of the wealthier families roasted a pig and shared slices thin as parchment. There was ale too, sour but warming. Toma sipped his carefully, savouring the illusion of festivity. Beside him, Breda smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Next year," she said softly, "we'll keep more back. Hide some under the floorboard." He nodded. It was what many did. The practice was known, but rarely spoken aloud. A small sack of grain buried near the hearth, a length of homespun hidden behind the roof beam. a handful of eggs exchanged privately, never counted. It was not defiance, it was survival. Still, the bailiff knew. He always knew. Some said he kept spies among the villagers. Others believed he could sense a lie by the way one breathed. Whether true or not, fear was enough to silence most. Toma's neighbour, old Willick, had once failed to report a litter of piglets. When discovered, he lost not only the piglets, but the sow and a quarter of his barley. He died that winter. Some said of shame, others of cold. Debt lingered long after the taxman left. If a family could not meet their dues, the manor imposed labour fines, extra days in the domain, night watch duty. Sometimes even the right to glean fallen grain was revoked. The land remembered, and the Lord's book kept every debt alive until paid, or passed on. Children inherited them. Along with the cottage, the tools, the patch of earth, came the unpaid dues of their fathers. Mia, now of marrying age, fretted, often. "What man will take a girl who carries debt?" she asked Breda, eyes wide with worry. Breda placed a hand on her sister-in-law's shoulder. "One who carries some of his own," she said gently. That night, after the feast fires had dimmed and the singing faded to humming, Toma lay beside Breda beneath a woolen blanket. Outside, the wind moved through the barley stubble with the hush of retreating voices. "I wonder," he said softly, "if the Lord has ever seen the lines in that ledger." Breda turned to him, her brow furrowed. "You mean the names?" "No," he said. "The lives." There was silence then. The kind that held not fear but reflection. And then, with a small, tired breath, Breda whispered, "He doesn't need to." And Toma understood. Because in Elderglen, the tax was not just measured in sacks and coppers. It was measured in joy deferred, in meals thinned, in repairs delayed, and children hushed. It was in the tension between feast and fear, between what one gave and what one lost by giving. And yet come spring, they would sow again. Because that too was taxed. The harvest was done. The carts had rolled through the fields, groaning beneath sheaves of barley and bundles of flax. The air, once thick with the scent of ripening grain, now hung with dust and the sighs of tired oxen. Stubble lay sharp and yellow in the earth, like the remains of a feast no longer shared. For most, the labour was over, but for others, a different work was just beginning. They were called the gleaners, the ones who came after, when the scythes had passed and the lords had claimed their share. In Elderglen, they were the women too frail to reap, the children too young to wield a sickle, and the elders whose hands trembled with memory more than strength. They moved quietly, bent low, their eyes scanning the soil not for beauty, but for survival. Breda had once gleaned as a girl, long before her marriage. Her mother had shown her how to find kernels tucked between furrows, how to shake the dust from straw, and judge which stalks might still yield grain. It was not just skill, it was instinct. An understanding passed from hand to hand, like a whispered secret. Now it was Mia's turn. Toma's sister had grown tall and sharp-eyed, with fingers quick and sure. She carried a rough woven basket, its rim frayed from use, and wore Breda's old apron tied around her waist. It hung heavy with patches, not thread. The manor allowed gleaning, but only by permission. A flag was raised from the steward's house. A square of dull linen hung from a crooked pole. Until it flew, the fields were forbidden. "They say it's mercy," Breda once muttered, watching the flag flutter. "But it's not mercy if you need permission to survive." Still, they waited. On the first day of gleaning, Mia joined 3 other girls and 2 older women. They walked barefoot to the far field, where the barley had been thickest. The stubble cut their feet, but they said nothing. Pain was expected. Pain was part of the harvest, even at its tail. Toma watched from the ridge. He remembered the year, when he too had gleaned, after their father had fallen ill, and the steward had doubled their labor obligations. He remembered how the wind stung his face as he knelt, how his fingers bled from cold and chaff, how he found just enough to feed them for 2 days. It was not shameful, it was necessary. Gleaners did not ask for pity. They did not speak of hunger as tragedy. They treated it like weather, inevitable, endured, and prayed through. That evening, Mia returned with less than half a basket. She placed it on the table with a small shrug. They said the reeve passed through earlier, took what was left behind. Breda frowned. He's not meant to. He said the wind scattered it, said it would spoil. Toma said nothing. He simply took the grain, poured it gently onto the table, and began to sort it by hand, separating seed from chaff, stone from stalk. Each kernel mattered. Each speck had a weight that no scale could measure. In the coming days, the gleaning continued. Some days were kinder. After the flax was gathered, Breda found a row of forgotten pods along the fence line. Their contents, tiny, dark seeds, would stretch the stew further. One morning, Toma helped an old man lift a fallen gate, and in return, the man pointed out a hollow where oats had spilled unnoticed. There were small victories, and with them, a strange kind of joy, not celebration, but relief. Still, not all were fortunate. Old Mab, nearly blind, wandered too far and fell into the stream. She was pulled out shivering and coughing, her hands still clutching 3 ears of barley. She lived, but barely. That winter, she lost a toe to frostbite. Little Hallett, who'd just begun to walk on his own, toddled into a ditch while his mother gleaned. They found him crying beneath a tangled net of thistle. His legs were scratched, but he had not let go of the one apple he'd found. Such moments became stories. They passed through the village like wind through leaves, light at first, then lingering. They were told not as warnings but as truths. "This is what it means," Ellen once said, sitting beside Breda as they mended Mia's shoes. "To live after the harvest, not with it." Gleaning was allowed only for a week. After that, the manor would turn the fields to pasture, and any who lingered were trespassers. Berun had made that clear the year before, when he chased a boy from the rye with a cane. "It's theft if it isn't yours," he said. "But it isn't his either," Toma whispered to Breda later. She said nothing, just placed a hand over his and pressed it, soft and steady. On the 7th day, the flag was lowered. The gleaners gathered their final bundles, heads bowed. Mia sat in silence that evening, her fingers still stained with earth. Toma passed her a bowl of stew thicker than usual, thanks to a handful of peas Breda had traded. They ate in silence, then together watched the fire burn low. Later that night, Breda spoke into the dark. "I wonder how many seeds lie forgotten in the soil." Toma turned toward her, his voice low. "Enough maybe to feed the mice." She smiled faintly. "Enough, maybe, to grow next spring." It was a dangerous kind of hope, the belief that something might come from what was discarded. But it was hope nonetheless. And for the gleaners of Elderglen, that was the only crop they could claim without permission. Winter did not arrive with storm or howl, but with silence. It crept in slowly, like water beneath a door, chilling the air in the early hours, dulling the colour from the leaves, pressing its weight into every breath. By the time the first frost clung to the hedges and the stream slowed to a whisper, Elderglen had already begun to brace itself. In the low stone cottages of the serfs, preparations were neither grand nor sufficient. Firewood was gathered weeks before, stacked beside each, home in neat, anxious piles. Herbs were strung from rafters, sage, thyme and yarrow, more for hope than healing. Root vegetables filled the larder in baskets lined with straw, and clay jars of dried lentils sat like treasure against the far wall. But no matter how well one prepared, the cold always found its way in. Toma felt it first in his fingers. No longer. Quick and sure, they stiffened at dawn when he tried to fasten the rope on the goat's pen. He breathed on them, rubbed them, but still they trembled. Breda gave him mittens she'd stitched from scraps of wool, patched again and again, but the chill seeped through like water through cracked stone. Inside, the fire became the heart of the home. Breda tended it like a living thing, feeding it, coaxing it, speaking softly to it when it flickered too low. Mia helped her, learning which twigs burned fastest, which logs smoked, which coals to bury in ash for the morning. They became fire watchers as much as women. Ellen, their mother, grew quieter with each shortening day. She would sit near the hearth, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Her cough came more often now, dry and deep. Breda wrapped her in layers of linen and sat close, but warmth was hard to hold. Even wrapped in blankets, Ellen's breath came like smoke from a dying flame. Winter in Elderglen was not dramatic. It did not shout. It pressed. It held. Outside, the snow came soft and thin, not in blizzards, but in small offerings that melted and froze again, turning paths to ice. The animals huddled closer to the cottages. Chickens stopped laying. The goats' ribs became more visible. The stream, once lively with chatter and light, now whispered beneath a thin sheet of ice, as if afraid to be heard. Toma walked less. When he did, it was slowly, carefully, feet wrapped in cloth, shoulders hunched against the wind. He checked on neighbours, mended a fence, helped lift a fallen beam. There was little to do, but more to endure. It was not the cold alone that made winter hard. It was the waiting. The days passed with the dull rhythm of routine. There was no sowing, no reaping, no tithes, no feast. Just the hours between waking and sleep, measured by the fire's strength and the size of each meal. Food was rationed with care. One turnip stretched across 2 stews, one loaf of bread divided into 6 slices. Breda kept a ledger in her mind, tracking every portion, every spoonful. "We must last through Candlemas," she said. "The snow will lift then." Mia asked, "Once, what if it doesn't?" Breda didn't answer. There were stories, of course. Tales passed around the fire like warm cups on cold nights. Some were hopeful, of springs that came early, of animals returning fat and tame. Others were not, of families buried beneath snow, of wolves slipping through broken doors, of hunger so sharp it carved madness into the mind. No one told those stories loudly. They lived in the hush between heartbeats. Toma tried to keep spirits raised. He sang old songs with Mia, hummed tunes his father once sang while splitting wood. He whittled small figurines, animals mostly, and left them near the hearth for the little ones in the village to find when they visited. Sometimes laughter came, thin, but real. Still, the cold tested even joy. Father Ulrich came less often. His joints ached, and the path from the church grew treacherous. When he did visit, he brought a candle and a prayer, murmuring blessings in Latin, then staying just long enough for his breath to fog the room. "We are never alone," he would say, not even in the silence. Toma wanted to believe him. But there were nights when even belief curled up like a leaf in frost. On one such night, as the wind rattled the shutter and the fire burned low, Toma lay awake beside Breda, listening to the brittle crack of ice along the eaves. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, "Only of forgetting what warmth feels like." He turned toward her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and held her tightly, not out of passion, but defiance. Outside, the stars shone, cold and clear, distant fires in a sky that gave no heat. Yet inside the small cottage, beneath wool and breath and quiet hope, 2 serfs made it through another night. And that was all winter allowed. Not victory, not escape, just endurance. And so the days passed, slow, silent, small. Until, one morning, Toma awoke to find the shutter ajar and light spilling in. Not grey, but golden. He stepped outside and found the first green tip of crocus pushing through, the snow. The air still bit, but something new stirred beneath the surface. Spring was not here yet, but it had written. In the snow, in the light, in the breath that no longer steamed quite so thick. And Toma smiled, because even winter, in all its quiet tyranny, could not keep the earth asleep forever. In Elderglen, before the rooster called, and long before the manor stirred, one pair of eyes was always open. They belonged to Gurth, the reeve. He was a man of medium height and middling build, unremarkable in shape or stature. But what set him apart was his gaze, steadfast, unsmiling, and always present. Wherever the villagers went, it often felt as though Gurth had already passed that way, or was just about to. The reeve was not a lord. He was one of them, born of serf stock, raised in the same mud and straw, fed on the same barley mash and bitter greens. But unlike the others, he wore a leather belt too finely tooled for his station, and his boots rarely bore mud. He answered only to the steward, and through him, to Lord Arcelin. Toma remembered when Gurth was chosen. It had been 5 winters ago. The former reeve, a stooped man named Alfred, had collapsed beside the flax beds and never risen again. The village whispered that he'd been too kind, too lenient with counts, too blind to theft. When his heart failed, the steward wasted no time. Gurth had been quiet before, a man who spoke little and asked less. That changed swiftly. The morning after his appointment, he walked the fields with a tally rod in one hand and a sheaf of parchment in the other. He asked questions no one dared ignore. How many hens this year, Breather? Where did you find the timber for that new stool, Thomas? Your son seems well fed, Elric. Been trading outside the manor? It wasn't that he shouted or struck. He didn't need to. Power in Gurth's hands was not forceful. It was observant. He watched, and watching was enough. A serf's life, already heavy with labor, grew heavier with the weight of being seen. It changed the way villagers moved. They whispered more. They turned their faces away when passing the reeve. They kept one ear tuned always to the sound of his boots. Breda, wise as ever, called it the quiet yoke. The Lord doesn't need a whip, she said once, folding linen beside the hearth. He only needs Gurth to look. Even in his kindness, there was suspicion. When a chicken went missing, he asked the poor first. When a roof was repaired, he inquired about materials. When laughter lingered too long near the common, he stepped in, not to stop it, but to listen. Toma tried to stay invisible. It was safer that way. But invisibility was hard when the reeve remembered everything. Your goat looks well again, Gurth said one morning. Recovered quickly. Strange, considering the sickness last month. It's the broth Breda makes, Toma replied carefully. Gurth nodded, too slowly. Or perhaps the herbs from the far woods. Toma said nothing more. He didn't mention that he'd traded a carving for a handful of dried thyme with a passing tinker. Best not to invite more questions. The reeve's authority came not just from observation, but from implication. He rarely accused outright. He didn't need to. A look, a note in the steward's book, a word whispered in passing, and suddenly a family found their gleaning rights revoked or their tax doubled. Yet it was also Gurth who tallied births and deaths, who settled disputes over boundaries, who arranged repairs to the village well when it cracked in frost. He was not a tyrant. He was worse. He was indispensable, because the reeve was a serf and therefore understood. He knew where to press and when to retreat. He knew which grandmother would crack first under questioning, which boy was likely to wander beyond the Lord's woods. He knew, and so they feared, not hatred, not even anger, just that slow, simmering unease that makes every knock at the door a question. What did he see? What does he know? Breda told Toma once, in a voice barely above a whisper. Fear is the seed. Girth is the soil. Still, Girth had no wife, no children, no friends that Toma had ever seen. He ate alone. He prayed alone. And though he passed among the people, he walked apart from them. Sometimes, Toma wondered whether the reeve chose this life, or whether it had chosen him. What did it cost to belong to no one but the manor? That question lingered on a day when Girth came to inspect the boundaries near the stream. The rains had shifted the stones that marked Breda's small garden. She'd moved them back, no more than a hand's width, but Girth noticed. You know the law, he said gently, pointing with his tally rod. You'll need to yield that patch. Breda did not argue, but later that night, her eyes held a sadness sharper than frost. It was only 4 steps of soil, she whispered. Toma nodded, and yet he saw it. Because that was Girth's true strength, not cruelty, not cunning, but presence. He was always there. When the village children played too close to the orchard wall, he watched. When the priest preached of mercy, he stood, in the back, arms folded, gaze steady. When harvest came, he counted. When famine struck, he noted who still looked strong. And when spring arrived, he would be there too, measuring, questioning, remembering. He was the book that never closed. But villagers of Elderglen never saw Lord Arkelin. They rarely heard the steward, but they felt Girth, not in violence, not in punishment, but in the silence that came when someone entered the room. And though he bore no sword, they all knew, a single word from him could shape a season, or ruin one. In this way, power did not pass through decree or doctrine. It passed through observation. And nothing, not even the serf's breath, was truly their own when the reeve was watching. In Elderglen, no one was truly alone. Even the smallest cottage stood within calling distance of another. Doors, though humble, faced one another. Paths curved naturally toward the centre, as though the earth itself encouraged company. Voices carried easily through thatched walls, and smoke from hearths blended in the evening air, indistinguishable. To live in a serf village was to live in the constant presence of others, family, neighbours, watchers, and witnesses. There was little room for secrets, and even less for solitude. Toma knew this intimately. From the time he was old enough to carry a bucket, he had been part of the web that bound Elderglen together. His labour mattered, his silences mattered, his mistakes echoed. A broken fence might mean a neighbour's sheep wandered. A missed prayer might spark quiet questions. The village was both net and nest, shelter and snare. There was warmth in it. To be sure, when Breda gave birth to their first child, a cluster of women gathered at once, bringing cloth, boiled herbs, and prayers. One rubbed her back with lavender oil. Another sang an old lullaby in a dialect older than the manor. The child was born just past midnight, under the red gleam of a harvest moon. They named her Annette, and for a week, neighbours brought small gifts. A strip of linen, a spoon carved of ashwood, a wool cap passed down through 4 families. No one expected thanks. It was simply what was done. When Ellen, Toma's mother, grew too weak to draw water from the stream, young Mab took it upon herself to fetch a pail each morning, never asking, never late. When the blacksmith's boy injured his foot, Toma and 2 others rebuilt the family's fence while he healed. These were not favours, they were survival. Because when life was so narrow, so relentlessly practical, generosity became necessity. There were no riches to hoard, no reputations to build, only the balance of giving and receiving as measured in kindness, silence, or shared burdens. And yet, that same closeness brought weight. Every gesture was noted, every slip remembered, and old injuries, even those long mended, could return with a glance. Toma recalled the feud between Haldan the weaver and Krenna the spinner. It began over a borrowed spindle, never returned, or perhaps over a lamb that vanished in the night. No one remembered exactly, but for 5 years they passed each other without speaking. At the midsummer dance, they stood on opposite sides of the green. At church, they knelt far apart. And when Krenna's roof collapsed in the storm of 73, Halden helped rebuild it only after the priest intervened. Grudges lingered like mildew, slow, silent, and stubborn. Even among kin, tensions simmered. Breda's cousin Leona had once promised to share a harvest share after a storm ruined Breda's garden. When she delivered only half, claiming her own hens had gone ill, Breda said nothing aloud, but the bond frayed. Invitations faded, words shortened. In a world so small, every omission had meaning. There were also rules, unwritten, but rigid. A widow might glean early if no man lived in her house. A boy could not take a wife from beyond 3 villages unless the manor permitted. Disputes over fences were settled not by measure, but by memory and consensus. Father Ulrich served not only as priest, but as peacemaker. He kept a careful eye on these small fractures, smoothing them where he could with prayer, parable, and bread. When the cobbler accused his neighbour of hiding grain, the priest brought both to the chapel and lit a candle between them. "Let the light reveal what truth cannot," he said. No one admitted fault, but the next day, the cobbler offered a pair of sandals, newly stitched, and his neighbour sent over dried apples. That was enough. Justice in Elderglen was not about fairness, it was about balance. And yet, balance could be brittle. When Mir began, courting Janice, a boy from the edge of the forest settlement, tongues wagged. His mother had once been fined for using the manor's timber without license. His sister had danced too freely at the solstice fire. Whispers followed him like burrs. Toma and Breda cautioned Mira, not unkindly. "They are good people," Mir insisted. "They may be," Breda said, "but good isn't always welcome." In time, the courtship ended, not from conflict, but from exhaustion. Too many glances, too many questions. Mir said nothing, but her smile dulled for a season. That was the quiet tyranny of the village. It bound as much with expectation as with affection. Still, in the dark days, when the frost lingered too long or the stew ran thin, it was the village that saved them. Not through speeches or grand gestures, but through presence. A knock at the door. A cup of broth left at the threshold. A song hummed by the well while drawing water. Annette, Toma, and Breda's daughter grew within that net. She learned early which doors to knock on for honeycomb scraps, which old men told, stories of fire and saints. She braided hair with the other girls and learned the weaving chant from Leona, who, despite the past, had grown fond of her quick fingers. One winter night, as snow tapped gently on the shutters, Breda said to Toma, "She'll never know a world without them." "No," he agreed, "and that may be a blessing or a burden." He looked toward the sleeping hearth, where the embers still glowed faintly, because in Elderglen, your strength came from those around you. But so did your limits, and in that tangle of love and watching, of warmth and wariness, the serf's life was shaped, not only by soil and lord, but by the village that never stopped seeing. It was on Annette's 7th birthday that the truth settled hardest in Toma's chest. There was no great celebration, just a bowl of sweetened oat porridge and a ribbon Breda had stitched from a strip of old linen dyed with elderberry. The ribbon was tied in Annette's hair, curling slightly at the end where the dye had dried unevenly. She twirled before the hearth, laughing with a joy untouched by frost or fatigue. And Toma, smiling, felt a hollowness beneath the warmth. She was growing, taller, each season, curious, clever, strong. Already, she knew how to coax the goat into her pen, how to stir the stew without burning, how to greet Father Ulrich with the exact tilt of the head that marked respectful piety. But more than that, she knew the land. She knew the names of the furrows, the feel of each patch of soil beneath her toes. She could tell which trees bloomed early, which grasses meant rain, which birds came before frost. Her childhood was being raised by the village and the earth in tandem. And yet, her path was already written. Toma had once believed that perhaps, just perhaps, his daughter might have choices. Not many, not grand ones, but some. That she might grow to learn a trade, to join a convent, to walk beyond the boundary stones and choose where her life unfolded. But the truth came quietly, as it always did. It came when the steward's clerk visited, carrying a worn roll of parchment. He sat with the reeve beneath the yew tree and called names, measuring generations, not in pride, but in productivity. Daughter of Toma, son of Ranulf, he'd said, eyes barely lifting. Bound by tenure, 10 chains of field under Arsalin's, manor, inheritance set, just like that. Annette's name was written beneath Toma's, a neat line connecting her to the land, not in poetry, but in law. She did not own it, could not leave it, could not marry beyond it without paying, could not dream beyond it without risk. It was her inheritance, not just the soil or the cottage or the goat, but the duty, the limitations, the weight. Toma said nothing as the clerk scratched ink upon sheepskin, but that night, as Breda lay beside him and the fire softened to a murmur, he whispered, "She's only 7. Breda did not answer at first. She turned toward him, her hand finding his beneath the blanket, and then, quietly, "So were you, once." That was the cruelty of it. The circle. It did not matter how good you were, how hard you worked, how deeply you loved, or how fiercely you hoped. The wheel turned regardless. The name passed on. The soil accepted it, and the child bore it. Toma's father had said it once, sitting in the same doorway Toma now occupied. We plant children like we plant grain, in rows, in season, and never too far from where we were planted. At the time, Toma thought it sad. Now he knew it was simply true. There was no law that allowed Annette to choose her path. She could not apprentice without the Lord's leave, could not be educated without the priest's approval, could not leave the village without a writ. Even dreaming differently required care. Father Ulrich taught the children letters, just enough to read a psalm, not enough to write one. Enough to serve the church if called, not to question its order. The girls were taught humility, obedience, grace, not ambition, not defiance. And yet, Annette dreamed. She asked once, "What lies past the old bridge, Papa?" Toma smiled. "Another village." "What about past that village?" "A town." "Past the town?" He hesitated. "Perhaps a city. Have you seen it?" "No." She frowned. "Could I?" He looked at her long then, her cheeks pink with firelight, her hands still clutching the ribbon Breda had made. And he said the only thing that could be both honest and kind. Perhaps. Because no was too cruel, and yes was too false. And so, like so many fathers before him, Toma gave her the gift of uncertainty, a space where hope might live, even if it never grew. Inheritance was more than legal bondage. It was a way of thinking passed from tongue to ear, from sigh to silence. Breda had once hoped to learn healing. Her grandmother had known poultices, herbs, midwifery chants, but there was no formal path, no recognition for such wisdom. The steward forbade her from leaving the village for apprenticeship, and Father Ulrich reminded her that ambition was not the same as virtue. So she taught Annette in quiet moments, the names of leaves, the smell of fever, the prayer for calm during birth, whispered, as though even knowledge might offend the order. Mir, too, had been caught in it. She'd once loved a boy from outside Elderglen, not far, only 3 fields east. But to marry him meant petitioning the manor, offering a gift, risking disfavor. When the boy left without her, she never spoke of it again. Now she spun flax, watched the girls braid hair, and hummed to herself when no one listened. Toma once asked her, "Do you regret not trying?" She looked at him a long while, then said, "I regret that trying cost so much." That too was part of inheritance, the fear of asking, because to ask was to be seen, and to be seen was to be measured, and the measure was almost always less than what one hoped. Still, each morning, Annette rose and greeted the sky as if it belonged to her. She ran through the stubbled fields with bare feet, named the birds in song, told stories to the goats as though they were enchanted. Toma watched her, heart torn between joy and ache. Because even if she was bound, she did not yet know it, and in that unknowing, she was free. For now, it began, as such things often did, with a whisper. No names, no claims. Just a breath of rumour drifting through the barley rows like early mist. It passed from lips to ears and back again, its shape shifting each time, like a shadow stretched. By candlelight, they say a villain fled Blackmere and was never caught. Toma heard it from the blacksmith's apprentice, who'd heard it from the tanner's boy, who'd heard it from a peddler 3 villages west. No one knew the man's name, only that he left in darkness, taking nothing but a satchel of rye, and the boots off his feet. They say he crossed the river, another voice added, and made it to a free town, works for coin now, has a wife, land of his own. Toma said nothing, but the thought sat with him, as unwelcome and persistent as a stone in a shoe. Rumours were not new to Elderglen. They arrived like seeds on the wind, small, weightless, and sometimes dangerous. A new king had taken a distant throne. A lord had fallen from favour. A plague was stirring far to the south. A miracle had been seen in a chapel window. Some were harmless, others were not, because even a whisper could be a spark, and sparks, though tiny, were watched. The reeve's eyes grew sharper when rumours rose. Gurth listened not only to words, but to tones. He watched for silence between neighbours, for laughter that came too freely, for gazes that held just a little, too long. It was said that rumour was a sin of the tongue, but in the manor's eyes, it was more a kind of quiet sedition, because the stories that scared them most were not of monsters or sickness or fire. They were stories of possibility. Toma knew this. He remembered the tale of old Willem, a serf, who once claimed to have seen a noble's garden where flowers were grown only for beauty, not for food, not for medicine, just to be admired. They had roses, Willem said, and tulips with heads like fire. No one believed him, but the idea lingered, that somewhere life could be lived not just for surviving, but for seeing. That story was told once at a midsummer gathering, and never again. Father Ulrich warned gently of envy. Gurth warned not at all, but 3 days later, Willem's son was reassigned to the manor granary for a full season, unpaid, a punishment for nothing, for saying. And so, the villagers learned caution. They still spoke. Of course they did. But they chose their words like one chooses herbs for a healing poultice, sparingly, carefully, and only when needed. Still, the stories persisted. There was one about a woman who refused the steward's demand for her youngest son to serve at the manor. She locked him in the root cellar and told the reeve he'd been taken by fever. The boy escaped through the thatch, fled at dusk, and wrote letters from a monastery 5 years later. No one had seen the letters, but everyone believed them, because belief, even unproven, had power. Breda, practical as always, once shook her head at a tale. "It doesn't matter if it's true," she said. "It matters that we need it to be." And it was true. They needed those stories, because the law was clear. The ledger was real. The reeve's rod left marks that did not fade. But rumour was fluid. It could reach places laws could not. Like the story of the hidden path through the eastern woods, said to have been cut generations ago by a fleeing reeve who regretted his role. No one had seen it. But each autumn when the leaves fell, a faint trail appeared beneath the old oaks, half swallowed by earth but still there. Mia swore she saw it once. Toma had followed it for a while once too, just far enough to wonder. Even Father Ulrich, in his own quiet way, played a part. He told parables that sounded like scripture, but spoke too directly to be coincidence. Tales of lost sheep who found their own way home, of fields abandoned for richer soil, of gates closed by men and opened by angels. He never named names. But after those sermons, the village sat quieter, not fearful, just watching. Because rebellion, in Elderglen, did not come with swords or banners. It came in moments. A man who kept part of his honey in a hidden jar. A woman who traded wool outside the steward's writ. A child who asked why the reeve never smiled. These were not revolts, but they were resistance, not loud, not visible, but real and dangerous in their own way, because they reminded people that the manor's grasp, though long, was not infinite. Toma sometimes wondered if Lord Arcelin knew of the rumours, if he cared. Perhaps he thought them harmless. Perhaps he knew fear was easier to sow than obedience, and rumour was simply another crop to manage. But if so, he misjudged. Because fear fades, rumour endures, and in those whispers, traded over fences, behind barrels, beneath blankets, something stirred. Not rebellion, not yet, but the idea of it. And in a world where even thoughts had to kneel, the idea was enough to make the manor walls feel just a little less high. That night, as Toma lay beside Breda and the wind moved gently through the eaves, he whispered to her, "Do you think it's true? About the man from Blackmere?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think someone left once. Somewhere. I think they got away." And that perhaps was all they needed. Not proof, just possibility. There are many ways to measure a man's place in the world. Some count land, some count coin. But in Elderglen, one need only open a pot of stew and listen. If it bubbled thick, filled with meat and root, its scent rising like warmth from memory, then it belonged to the manor. If it hissed thinly, clinging to the bottom of the pot, smelling more of ash than meal, it belonged to the serfs. Toma had known hunger, yes, but not starvation. Not often. His hands were too steady, his back too strong, and Breda too skilled for them to fall far. But what they lacked, what most serfs lacked, was not sustenance. It was flavour. They lived on barley and beans, on turnips, leeks, peas, onions, the occasional egg, the rare crumb of cheese, bread, dense, dark, often made with flour thickened by ground peas or even bark, was the constant companion. And water, always water. In a good week, there might be broth. In a holy week, perhaps ale. But meat was memory. Toma remembered the first time he tasted goose. He had been 8. A feast day, Michaelmas perhaps, and Lord Arcelin's cook had gifted the bones and scraps to the village children as a kind of indulgence. The meat had been soft, fatty, laced with herbs Toma could not name. He ate it in silence, his fingers greasy, his heart thudding with something close to awe. And then it was gone. He dreamed of it for 3 nights. Breda, ever practical, rarely, spoke of such things. "We can't chew longing," she'd say. "Best not to feed it." But even she paused when a deer was struck by cart near the forest edge, and a sliver of flank was passed to them by a cousin in thanks for help butchering it. She made stew that night, real stew. Toma could smell it before he reached the gate. Annette danced near the pot like a bee drawn to nectar. They didn't speak during the meal, not until the bowls were scraped and the spoons laid down. "Will we have it again?" Annette asked, eyes wide. Breda smiled faintly. "When saints dine, with us perhaps." Because meat, to a serf, was not food, it was class. It belonged to feasts and finery, to cloaks trimmed with fur and boots that didn't leak. It was served on pewter plates in rooms where tapestries caught the chill, and candles numbered more than mouths. Toma had once glimpsed the manor kitchens, accidentally, when delivering cordwood. The air had smelled of rosemary and roasting lamb. He stood too long at the threshold, and a scullion barked, "Begone!" But the scent followed him for hours, even now, years later, when the wind came from the east and the manor cooked game for Lent's end. The air carried stories to the village. Children sniffed like dogs. Women closed their shutters. Men turned their faces to their tasks, pretending not to notice. It was not envy exactly. It was something deeper. The knowledge that taste, like voice, could be trained, and theirs had. Never been invited to the table. The church too dictated appetite. There were fast days, many. No meat on Fridays, no meat during Lent, no meat during Advent. But for serfs, most days were fasting days by default. Toma once asked Father Ulrich, "Is it a sin to crave what we never have?" The priest only smiled. "It is only a sin if you take it." And so they did not, except when they did, because on rare occasions, meat made its way to the village unseen. A hare caught by accident, a hen gone too old for eggs, a gift from a hunter passing quietly through. These were secrets, wrapped in cloth and passed with care. Breda once cooked pigeon in the night, so the scent would not rise. She stewed it with barley and covered the pot with linen soaked in vinegar to mask the aroma. When they ate, the room was dark. Mia wept softly when she tasted it, not because it was good, because it reminded her of what was missing. Even bones held meaning. After slaughter, the manor kept the meat, but sometimes left the offal. Breda boiled bones for days until the broth turned cloudy. Annette once licked a marrow shard like it was honey. Toma said nothing, because in that moment she was happy, and hunger had many shapes, not just emptiness, but absence, the knowing of what you're missing, and knowing you'll likely miss it all your life. Still, they made their food with care. Breda seasoned what she could: wild garlic, ground mustard seed, a splash of sour, and cider when available. Her stews, though simple, were crafted with love. Annette would often say, "Mama's pot is magic," and perhaps it was, because what it lacked in meat, it made up in memory. Toma once carved a small pig from wood and placed it on the mantel. A joke, a wish. Annette named it Feast. Every solstice, they patted its head for luck. Small rebellions, quiet hungers, they did not starve. But they never tasted freedom. And in a world where meat meant privilege, every bite remembered was a boundary felt. One evening, as the fire crackled and the bread was torn in slow, silent pieces, Annette asked, "Papa, if we had gold, what would you eat?" Toma looked at her eyes lit with curiosity and something deeper. "Venison," he said. Breda smiled. "Boiled with plums and sage," Annette grinned. "And duck?" "Oh yes," Breda said. "Roasted, skin crisped, with honey," Toma nodded. "And lamb, with rosemary and salt." They closed their eyes, imagining, not feasting, but knowing, that, once, perhaps someday, the taste of freedom might be more than just a dream on the tongue. The forest lay just beyond the last ploughed furrow, where the barley fields gave way to thicket and fern. It stood still and dark, a wall of green even in winter, its canopy reaching skyward like cathedral arches grown wild. To a child, it was mystery. To a serf, it was danger, not from wolves or spirits, though tales of both circled fires on winter nights, but from the law. The forest, in the eyes of the manor, belonged not to the land, nor to the people who tilled it, nor even to the birds that sang in its branches. It belonged to the Lord, not just the timber or the game, but the air itself. Toma remembered the first time he stepped beneath its boughs alone. He was 13, sent by his father to collect dead wood for mending the hearth. Not branches broken or cut, only what had fallen, and only from the outer edge. Even that carried risk. He'd walked with careful feet, his heart loud in his chest. The trees rose like sentinels, their trunks wide and watching. The ground beneath was soft with needles and damp with moss. The scent was heavy, sap and loam and something ancient. He filled his bundle in silence, then paused, tempted. Just beyond, the brambles, a rabbit sat beneath a hawthorn. Plump, unbothered, a step. Two. Toma's hand inched toward the sling tucked in his belt, but he stopped. Because even then, he knew, to take a rabbit was to challenge the Lord. Game was protected, not by fence, but by decree. Hares, deer, boars, creatures that roamed, freely were not free. They were owned. Their flesh, their fur, their very breath belonged to Lord Arcelin by royal writ. To harm them without license was poaching, a word that carried weight heavier than theft. Some were fined, others were flogged, a few were never seen again. So Toma stepped back. The rabbit fled, white tail flashing once before vanishing. He returned home with his bundle of deadwood and nothing more. That night, his father ruffled his hair, and Breda, then still a girl with keen eyes and quiet hands, gave him a warm biscuit she'd hidden from the day before. He had not sinned, but he had wondered. Now, years later, he watched Annette walk, the forest's edge. She too was curious. "Why can't we walk there?" she asked one morning, towing the line where grass met underbrush. "We can walk," Toma answered gently, "but we cannot take. Not even mushrooms. Not even. What about kindling? Only what's fallen. Never what grows." She frowned. "Even the trees." Especially the trees. It was hard to explain that the green world, before them, though untouched by fence or stone, was owned. That its gifts, though abundant, were not theirs. And yet sometimes they went, carefully, quietly, when firewood was low, when the stew needed flavour, when winter clung too long. Breda once guided Annette to a grove of wild garlic, hidden beneath a slope no reeve ever bothered to count. They took what they needed, no more, and left thanks in the old way, with 3 stones stacked on the nearest stump. It was a tradition older than the manor, perhaps older than the church. "Why the stones?" Annette had asked. "To say we're only borrowing," Breda whispered. There was power in that, but not protection. The reeve Girth knew the signs. He had eyes not only for people, but for paths. Once, when a boy from the next village was found with a squirrel carcass, he was bound and made to stand at the manor gate for 3 days, with the word thief burned into a plank around his neck. Toma had passed him once, carrying thatch. The boy's eyes were empty, and so the forest remained both temptation and warning. Even in song, it lived between beauty and fear. Old Ellen used to sing a lullaby of a maiden who ran into the woods and danced, with foxes until dawn. Annette loved it, especially the verse where the maiden spoke with a tree, and the tree answered. "Why did she go back?" she once asked. Toma paused. Because if she stayed, they would have hunted her. But she was kind. Yes, but kindness is not law. That too was a lesson of the forest. It did not care who needed. It only answered to who owned. And yet, in spring, the forest bloomed with defiance. Elderflower and violet, hazel buds, new mushrooms fat with rain, birds called with bold joy, and deer walked within yards of the village as if mocking the walls that divided them. Annette laughed each time she saw one. "They're not afraid," she said. Toma nodded. "Because they are free." She looked at him then, the way children do when they understand more than they can say. Will I ever be like them? He could not answer. Not honestly. But he bent down and said, "You already are." And in that moment, he hoped it might be true. Later, as the wind moved through the trees and the fire hissed low, Toma carved a small figure from pine. A girl, with her hands outstretched and her hair caught in wind. He placed it on the shelf beside the wooden pig. Annette named it Wanda. And each time she looked at it, she smiled. Because even if the forest was forbidden, its spirit had taken root. Quietly, patiently, in her heart. He arrived near dusk, not from the manor, nor any of the nearby villages, but from the west, where the road twisted out of sight, beyond hills Toma had only seen from the edge of his field. He was on foot, though his boots were stitched well and oiled against the mud. A satchel hung across his chest, worn and patched. and a rolled blanket was tied behind his shoulders. His tunic was simple but clean, and unlike any seen in Elderglen. Its fabric was dyed a soft green, not the dull olive of serfs wear, but something softer, almost vibrant. He walked with a staff, not a weapon, and a careful eye. And though he said little, everyone noticed. Strangers were rare in Elderglen. Roads were long, and time was short. Most who passed through were peddlers or monks, and even they did not linger. But this man, his name given only as Alden, asked, with politeness and coin, if he might sleep in the ale shed for a night. The reeve was not there. The steward would not be told until morning. And so Toma, being nearest, nodded. A small nod, one that cost nothing, and yet changed much. Annette was the first to speak to him. She approached with the boldness of a child who had not yet learned what fear looks like on a stranger's face. Her questions were many. Where had he come from? Did he have a horse? Had he seen a city? Alden smiled, kindly, not grandly, and answered each with measured words. He had come from a town called Bereth's Hollow, 3 days east. He had no horse, only boots. Yes, he had seen cities, many. Are they loud? Annette asked, eyes wide. They breathe like beasts, Alden said, and sleep like kings. That night, the ale shed glowed faintly from the lantern Toma left by the door, and the village stirred, not aloud, not in the open, but in glances, in whispers. Who is he? Breda asked softly. Toma shrugged. A traveller. He's not of the manor. No. Then he should not stay. But he had, and in staying, he brought a different kind of warmth, a dangerous one. At morning, Alden rose early, cleaned the space he'd borrowed, and offered a carved comb to Toma's family in thanks. It's maple, he said, from trees, where the frost sings. Breda turned it in her hand. It was smooth and elegant, the teeth fine and even. Where did you learn to make this? She asked. Alden smiled. From a man who once carved in a cloister, long ago. Toma said little, but inside him something stirred, a memory, perhaps, of the boy he'd been, the boy who once followed a peddler past the orchard wall, just to see how far the road ran. That evening, Alden sat near the communal hearth at the edge of the green. Children crept close. Old men leaned in without seeming to do so. Even the priest, Father Ulrich, arrived in quiet curiosity. Will you be heading east then? The priest asked. In time, Alden said. You're not of the manor? No. Then you must carry permission. I do. Alden pulled a slip of parchment, marked with a faded seal. It was enough. Legal. Even Girth, when he came at last, could say nothing. But he watched. Closely. That night, Alden told stories. Not loudly. Not boastfully. But gently, like a man unspooling. Thread. He spoke of a town where water ran in stone canals, where bread was baked in ovens big enough to walk inside. He described a chapel where the bells rang at midnight, and no one flinched. He told of a ship with sails like wings, and a woman who read words from a page as easily as one recites a prayer. The children stared, mouths open. The elders shifted uncomfortably, and Toma listened. Not because he believed it all, but because part of him wanted to. Afterward, Breda sat long beside the hearth. He speaks too easily, she said. He speaks well, Toma replied. That's what worries me. She was right, in a way, because Alden reminded them of what wasn't, what had never been offered, what might never be. And yet, he had not mocked them. He had not claimed superiority. He had simply been, and that, in itself, was enough to unbalance a place like Elderglen. The next morning, he left. No ceremony, no farewell. Just a nod, and a warm loaf given in thanks, still steaming from the oven. Annette watched him go, her hands clasped around the maple cone. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked. Toma looked to the road, where Alden's figure shrank between the hills. "No," he said softly, "but someone like him might." That afternoon, the reeve inspected the shed. "Did he say anything?" Girth asked. "No more than stories," Toma replied. Girth stared for a long moment. "Sometimes," he said, "stories are the first sign of forgetting one's place." He walked away before Toma could answer. That evening, as the fire crackled low and Annette slept with the comb beside her cheek, Toma turned to Breda. "Do you think we'll ever leave?" Breda was silent for a long while. Then, "I think the road is there. Whether we take it is something else." And in the quiet that followed, they both knew. Change had knocked, gently, kindly. But even that soft knock had left a mark. The first time Toma noticed it, it was small. A strain in his right knee, sharp and brief, when he bent to tie a bundle of flax. It passed quickly, and he thought nothing of it. Only that the ground had grown colder, perhaps, or the air wetter than usual. But the next time, it lingered. Then came the ache in his shoulder when lifting the plough, the way his fingers curled more tightly in the morning, as if reluctant to open with the day. The deep, slow groan of his spine as he stood, after hours in the field. The weight of time, once distant and silent, had begun to hum in his bones. He was not yet old, not in years, but serfdom aged a man in ways no calendar could track. Each season of labour wore down what no feast could replenish. The toll was not paid in silver, but in sinew. Breda saw it before he admitted it. "You wince more," she said, handing him a cup of nettle tea. "It's just the rain." She said nothing, only wrapped the cup in a cloth so the heat would not leave his hands too soon. Toma thought of his father then, Renolf, who had worked the land until his back bent like a sickle. He remembered the old man's breath, heavy in the evenings, the way his hands trembled when lifting even a bowl of soup. At the time, Toma had not understood. Now he did. The body, once willing, becomes cautious. It does not complain, not loudly. It simply resists. A step is slower, a load heavier. Sleep comes faster, but rest less complete, and memory becomes a refuge. In dreams, Toma still ran across the meadow behind the chapel, chasing shadows with Mir. He climbed trees. He raced the other boys to the stream and returned muddy, breathless, victorious. His mother would shake her head, smile, and scrub his face with a cloth too rough but full of love. He remembered the first time Breda took his hand, the feel of it, warm, unsure, real. Her thumb brushed his knuckle, and the world narrowed to that one point of contact, a heartbeat shared across skin. Now, that same hand helped him to his feet each morning. She did not speak of the change. She moved with him, around him, supported him not with pity, but with rhythm, an old dance, practiced through habit and care. Annette noticed too. "Papa, why don't you chop anymore?" He smiled. "Because the trees have grown taller than me." She laughed. "That's not why." "No," he admitted. "But it's a better story." Still, he worked, because there was no retirement in Elderglen, no rest granted for years given. A serf worked until he couldn't, and even then he was expected to help where he could, mend tools, tend gardens, teach the young to tie knots, and sharpen blades. Toma did all these things, but inside he carried a quiet sorrow, not for the fading of his strength, but for the expectation that it never would. There were no days off, only days when the pain was bearable. He found himself watching the older men more often, those whose limbs no longer obeyed, who sat beside the well or in the church pews, eyes cloudy, hands folded. They spoke little, but in their stillness there was a kind of wisdom. They had lasted, and in a world where few things endured, that meant something. Father Ulrich said that time was a blessing, that with each year came grace, but Toma wondered. He felt more weight than grace, more silence than wisdom. His joints told the weather. His heart, though strong, beat with a heaviness that sleep no longer lifted. Breda helped in more ways now. She tied the bundles. She fetched the water. She covered for his hesitations. And yet, she too was aging. Lines around her eyes. A slower step. A breath taken before lifting. The strength in her arms, once firm from kneading dough and pulling wool, now softened. They sat together one night, after the fire had burned down to embers. "I don't fear death," she said, unexpected. Toma looked at her. "I just don't want to go before Annette is grown." He nodded. That was the truest fear, not dying, but leaving work undone, a child unfinished, a promise half kept. They did not speak of it again, but the next day, Toma showed Annette how to mend a harness, strap, and that evening, Breda taught her how to render fat for tallow. Small lessons, quiet legacies, not for glory, not for fame, but for continuity, for the hope that, when they were gone, something useful would remain. The seasons moved on, as they always did. Spring returned with a gentleness Toma now noticed more, the scent of damp earth, the feel of sun on his back, the simple joy of waking without shivering. He moved slower, yes, but he moved, and each movement, however slight, was a kind of victory, because aging in Elderglen was not weakness. It was proof that he had survived the hunger seasons, the taxman's ledgers, the steward's demands, proof that he had bent but not broken, that he had endured, and that endurance, though quiet, was earned. One morning, Annette braided his hair while he sat on the stool outside the cottage. "You have white here," she said. He smiled. "That means I'm growing wiser, or slower. Perhaps both." She kissed the top of his head. "You're still my strongest." And for a moment, the weight of time felt less cruel, because in her eyes, he was not fading, he was becoming. It came first as a rumour whispered at the well. "A new levy," said the thatcher's wife, her voice tight. "The king's banners ride again. There's fighting on the border." Toma looked up from the cartwheel he was mending, his brow furrowing war. It was not a new word. He had heard it before, many times. Sometimes as stories from passing monks, sometimes in the sermons of Father Ulrich, and often in the weary murmurs of the reeve. But always, until now, war had belonged to other places, to castles far away, to maps with names he could not pronounce. It belonged to mounted knights and crimson cloaks, to cries of glory shouted over lands he would never see. But in truth, war never stayed where it began. It spread, not like a flame, but like frost. Quiet at first, then biting. The next day, the steward came on horseback. Behind him rode 2 soldiers in chainmail, their boots too clean, their faces too young. He dismounted at the village green and unfurled a scroll. "All subjects of Lord Arcelin's estate are called upon to furnish their fealty through grain, cloth, and conscripts. By decree of the crown." Toma's stomach dropped. He felt Breda's fingers tighten around his. "Who will they take?" Mir asked, her voice a thread. "Any man fit," came the reply. 10 from the manor lands, names drawn by the steward, no exceptions. They stood in silence, not from shock, from understanding, because war, though distant in sound and steel, always took something. 3 days later, the names were read aloud. Mira's youngest brother, the blacksmith's second son, a boy barely 17 from the mill, and 2 men with no sons, whose wives held their breath until the last syllable fell. Toma's name was not among them, but it did not matter. Relief was a luxury they could not afford, because for each man taken, 3 more were left with heavier burdens. The fields would not plough themselves. The grain would not harvest itself. The sheep would not mend their own fences. And now, with hands missing, the weight of spring planting bore down like never before. Toma rose earlier, worked longer, Breda too. Annette began carrying water twice a day, her small arms straining. Even the old, those who once only watched from shaded corners, returned to the soil, muttering prayers with each strike of the hoe. And always, in the distance, the shadow of war lingered. Letters came, sometimes, scrawled by monks, delivered by riders who would not stay. He lives. He was seen. He sends word. But often, there was silence, long silences. One mother wept, not for a son she knew was dead, but for a son she didn't know was alive. Toma watched the manor closely. More carts came, bearing tribute, sacks of grain, heavier than last season. Spindles of wool tied tight, given without thanks. Even Father Ulrich's altar lost its candles. Melted down, he said, to send wax to the camp churches. Pray for peace, he told them, but also pray for patience. Yet patience, like wheat, thins when stretched too far. The villagers began to speak less. Laughter grew scarce. Even feasts lost their warmth. At Michaelmas, when the geese should have been shared, none were offered. The steward claimed they were sent to feed the army, and perhaps they were, or perhaps they were not. No one dared ask. One afternoon, as Toma walked the edge of the barley field, he found the reeve standing still, eyes on the road. They say the war has turned, Girth said, not looking at him, that our side has lost ground. Toma said nothing. What happens, the reeve continued, when the ones who return come back broken? Toma did not answer, because he had no answer. He had seen what war did, even from afar. He had seen men return, with eyes that stared too long at nothing, with limbs that did not move, or did not move the same, with silences deeper than any hunger. He had seen what war took, even from those who never lifted a sword, and he knew it would come again. Because war was not only in the fighting, it was in the missing hands, the empty chairs, the quiet hearths, the way children stared at the road and waited. It was in the grain given to strangers, in the cloth torn for bandages, in the prayers whispered not for glory, but for survival. And so, they endured, because that is what serfs did. They were never asked, only commanded, never invited, only taxed, never armored, only emptied. And when war passed by, never through them, but always upon them, they carried the bruises in silence. That night, Annette asked Toma, "Will they come home?" He hesitated, then said, "Some will." She nodded, eyes downcast. "And some won't." He reached for her hand, held it, and whispered, "We remember them, no matter what," because that too was their resistance. Not banners, not swords, memory. To remember the names not carved in marble, but in wood, to keep alive. The story of those who were taken, not for greatness, but for duty, and to live on, even under the toll of war. Ellen died in the early hours of a grey morning, just before the cocks crowed. It was not dramatic, not loud. There was no last speech, no clutching of hands, no gasping for air. She simply exhaled once, softly, as if sighing into sleep, and did not draw breath again. Breda had been sitting beside her, weaving a patch for Annette's tunic. The thread slipped from her fingers before the realization set in. She did not cry. Not at first. Only reached over, brushed the thin hair from Ellen's brow and whispered, "You may rest now." Toma found them like that when he rose. He had known it was coming. Ellen, once so sharp of tongue and sure of hand, had faded like ink on old parchment. Her steps had slowed. Her gaze had drifted. In the last month, she had spoken only of things long past, of winters before Toma was born, of saints he'd never heard of a sister lost to fever when she was young. Still, she smiled when she saw Annette. always smiled. Now she lay still, her hands folded neatly, a piece of linen covering her feet. There was no priest yet, no tolling bell, no gathering crowd. But grief had already settled like dust in the corners of the room. In Elderglen, death was not a visitor. It lived quietly among them. It stood behind the hearth, beside the fields, beneath the yew in the churchyard. It waited, not cruelly, but certainly. It did not rush, but it never forgot. The village had its rituals, its rhythms. Toma fetched Father Ulrich before sunrise. The priest arrived with his small kit of oils and prayers, bowed his head, and murmured the liturgy, with soft cadence. There was no incense, but he brought a sprig of rosemary, which Breda placed near Ellen's hands. She was not afraid, Breda whispered. No, the priest replied. She remembered how to go. Later, Girth came to record the passing. He did not linger. He marked her name on his parchment and left. And still, the day went on, because death, though sacred, did not stop the work. The cow had to be milked. The bread had to rise. The morning fire had to be fed. Even as the body cooled beneath homespun wool, the world turned its wheel without pause. Anne cried in the garden, her face hidden in the curve of her arm. She told me stories, she said through the sobs. She said the stars listen if you whisper to them. Toma nodded. She believed it. Is she one now? He looked at the sky, still pale with dawn. She's part of it. The burial came at sundown. They could not wait for a formal coffin. Instead, Ellen was wrapped in the shroud she herself had woven long ago. It had hung for years in the rafters, waiting. Serfs did not often afford oak or stone, but they gave what they could: thread, song, and earth. The churchyard was small. The yew tree stood watch as it had for generations, its branches twisted like time itself. They dug the grave themselves, Toma and 2 others. The soil was cold, but not frozen. Each shovel full felt heavier than usual, though it was not the weight of dirt they carried. It was memory. When the pit was ready, they lowered her gently. Annette placed a sprig of dried lavender beneath the cloth. Breda sang a low hymn, the same one Ellen had sung to Annette as a babe. It was not formal, it was not scripted, but it was real. After the last clod fell, the villagers stood in silence. One by one, they left, back to their hearths, their tasks, their lives, and the hill was quiet again. Thomas stayed behind. He sat by the yew, watching the light fade. He thought of his mother's hands, so often red with cold, cracked from wool and water. He remembered the way she scolded, the way she hummed when she thought no one was listening, the way her eyes softened when watching the fire. He did not cry. Not then. But something inside him settled differently, as though a weight he'd carried all his life had shifted. That night, the cottage felt too still. Breda moved carefully, her motions gentle. Annette slept in the bed where Ellen once lay. Toma sat at the hearth, staring into the coals. She always said death was like crossing a threshold, Breda murmured beside him, like stepping through a door into another room. Toma nodded. She said she'd wait by the window. They sat there, not speaking more, because grief, like love, did not need many words. In the days that followed, the world resumed. A new tenant moved into Ellen's cottage. Her meagre possessions were shared, her spindle to Breda, her cup to Anne, her cloak to the widow who lived near the stream. No one spoke of inheritance. There was nothing to pass on except memory, and memory was not taxed. Toma planted rosemary near the yew, where the soil still bore the fresh mark. He did not mark the spot with stone, only with silence, because in Elderglen the dead were not forgotten. They walked quietly in stories, in lullabies, in habits. They lived on in the way Breda shaped a loaf, in the way Toma patched a sleeve, in the way Annette whispered to the stars. And in time, the grief softened, not gone, just gentler, like a hand that once held yours, still warm in your memory. The end of the year did not arrive with bells. There were no trumpets, no feasts, no sudden turning of time. In Elderglen, it came on the hush of snow and the long yawn of wind through bare trees. It came quietly, like an old friend at the door, bringing not news, but rest. Toma knew it had arrived when the frost lingered past midday and the crows began to call in pairs instead of flocks. The trees no longer sighed. They stood silent, wrapped in hoarfrost and dreams. He woke that morning with a dull ache in his shoulder, not sharp enough to complain, just enough to remind him he was alive and aging. Breda stirred beside him, her, breathing soft and steady. At her back, Annette lay tucked beneath a quilt stitched from scraps 3 winters ago, now patched again with care. Outside, the snow had deepened, not in great drifts, but in patient layers. Every day, a little more. Every sound softened. The village, once full of footsteps and voices, now murmured only in whispers and the creak of timber. Winter had settled like a cat curling into a corner. The fields lay white, the tools hung still in the shed, and the livestock moved slowly in, their pens, their breath misting like ghosts. Inside their cottage, fire ruled the day. It was fed reverently. Toma took pride in his stacks of dry wood, prepared in August when the sun still burned the back of his neck. Now those stacks meant warmth, and warmth meant life. Breda stirred porridge, humming a tune that had no name. She added dried rose hips to sweeten it, just a few, saved from midsummer's bloom. The scent rose with the steam, delicate and homebound. "We've 1 more jar of lard," she said, "and 3 apples still good." Toma nodded. "We'll make them last." Annette helped grind oats by hand, her sleeves rolled up, freckles blooming in the warmth. "Is it the last day of the year?" she asked. "It is," said Breda, "though the stars don't mark it with numbers." "How do they mark it then?" "With stillness," Toma answered, "and silence." She looked out the window at the falling snow and seemed to understand. That night, as twilight deepened, the village held its only true ritual of the turning year, the long fire. No one rang a bell to call them, no one shouted, but one by one they emerged from cottages, cloaked in wool and silence, bearing logs, kindling, and small bundles wrapped in cloth. In the village green, the fire was built, not large, not grand, but steady, and when the flint struck and the spark caught, the flame rose like a sigh from the earth itself. They stood around it, not in circle, not in ceremony, but as they always had, shoulder to shoulder, face to flame, hearts open. The heat was welcome. The light gentled the lines in their faces. No speeches were made. Instead, they listened to the crackling, to the snow falling on cloaks, to the wind tracing the eaves of their homes. And in that stillness, the year breathed its last. Toma stood with Breda on one side, Annette curled close on the other. He watched the fire and saw, not just flames, but all that had passed through it. Ellen's soft passing, Alden's stories, the pain in his knees that lingered longer each morning, the debt of war, the laughter of Annette when she carved her first wooden toy, the silence Breda kept when her hands ached, but her smile stayed, and the field, always the field, waiting beneath the snow like a sleeping creature, tired but alive. One by one, the villagers stepped forward and placed something in. The fire, a scrap of wool, a twist of dried herbs, a carved token, an apple core, not sacrifices, not prayers, just memory. Toma stepped forward last. He carried a small bundle, a sliver of the wooden pig broken during the harvest, worn smooth by Annette's hands. He dropped it in the fire. It hissed, flared, and was gone. He whispered, "Thank you," though he did not know to whom. Perhaps to the land, perhaps to time itself. When they returned home, The fire was still warm in the hearth. Breda lit a fresh candle, the last of their tallow stock. Annette yawned, curled up beside the woven cat doll Ellen had sewn 2 winters ago. "Will next year be better?" she murmured sleepily. Breda smoothed her hair. "Better. Worse. It will come, and we will greet it." That night, the wind sighed low through the thatch. The fire danced faintly in its stone belly, and the snow continued to fall. Thomas could not sleep. He sat by the window and looked out, into the white. He thought not of kings or lords, not of debts or freedom, only of the soft hush of winter, the gift of enough, the warmth of small arms around his waist, and the courage it takes to keep living when the world asks you only to survive. The fire cracked one last time. Thomas closed his eyes, and the year, at last, slept.